Welcome to Box Couture. This tutorial will give you an overall step-by-step to create the Tyler knit shorts. Let's start by going over the fabric. Located on the pattern PDF, you'll find the ruler to choose the perfect knit for this garment. To determine if the fabric you are buying or have on hand is correct, fold the fabric to test the stretch, so you have the selvage to the right and left view. Then fold over the fabric. For this pattern, the fabric needs to stretch at least 10%. Place 2 pins, one at 0 and one at 5 inches. Stretch the fabric and look at the ripples the fabric makes. What we are looking for when we're stretching the fabric out is the ripples. If you stretch it to 10% and you see no ripples, this is a good indication that this fabric will work for this pattern. If you try to get a pattern and it stretches, as you see here when I stretch it to 20% and it ripples, then that's not a really good stretch fabric for this pattern. You might have chosen the correct fabric that has the correct amount of stretch to it, but if you look at it, it's a little bit too thin. You can see right through it. This would not be suitable for shorts. On the other hand, if you choose something like this, a French terry, something that has a little bit more weight, something that you can't see through, this will work perfectly for making shorts. On the instruction PDF, you'll find the pattern layout. The binding is made to be cut from a lightweight knit. The stretch is not relevant, but if you can use a jersey or a complementary lightweight fabric, this would be ideal. Using a cutting mat and a rotary cutter, cut the ribbing for 1 inch. If you're wanting to use scissors, choose ones that have a micro serrated bottom. This will help you cut the fabric without it slipping. These have little ridges on the bottom, like serrated edge, and on the top are regular scissors. These are also good for cutting sheer lightweight fabrics. It helps it from slipping when you're cutting it. If you want to use scissors, all you have to do is just mark the 1 inch with chalk and then cut with the scissors. So here I have all the pattern pieces cut, my binding, my pockets, my front, my backs. So the first thing you want to do is wind the bobbin of your sewing machine with a woolly nylon. So to start sewing, you're going to need the regular thread on the needle and then the woolly nylon in the bobbin case, and then we can sew the binding to the pocket opening. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to wrap around the binding, and I'm marking here a 1/2 inch so it's all even. I'm using a pencil so you can see what I'm doing, but normally you'd want to use something like a chalk or something that's not permanent. You can eyeball this, you don't need to mark it, but once you do, you can just fold that over and pin it. And then what I found would be best would be to press it so it has a nice crease to it. So then I remove the anchor pins and I put just 2 pins in the back side, and then I flip it over and then I just pin 2 or 3 pins in the front just to keep the binding in place, and then I can take the ones in the back out. It would be easier to sew if you don't have any pins on the bottom. And then again, when you're sewing it, just use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you can cut off any excess. And then if you want, you can also go in the back and trim down the binding from the back. Let's begin with doing the drawstring opening. We're going to place eyelets or grommets. Here's what an eyelet looks like. It doesn't have a back to it. And here are grommets. They have a front piece and a back piece. I like grommets better, but you can definitely use an eyelet. And you just want to make sure that this drawstring you're using is going to go through the hole. And here are different sizes that you could use. You just want to make sure that the drawstring can go through the hole. And here I have the marking from the pattern, and I'm just going to use one of 2 methods. You can either stretch out the fabric so you can apply the eyelet or grommet. This would make it more secure, but you can also cut a small little hole, and that would fit with your eyelet or grommet. and then using a setting tool. You can use this by hand, and this would come in the kit that you would buy, and you can hammer it in, or you can use a hand press. So this is what the hand press with the dies would, how you would use it. And if you don't have any of these tools, or you don't want to do it this way, you can definitely just do a basic buttonhole. So here it is, we're applying the pocket to the front piece, and then you can just pin that and stitch it around. I'm stitching it from the back. Also, an alternative would be to overlock the pocket, so it would give it a nice clean edge. But since knits don't fray, you don't have to. It's an optional thing. And then what I like to do is I like to stay stitch the waist and the side seam of the pocket. Joining the front to the back, we're going to sew the inseam. So you're going to match the front piece to the back piece and sew the inseam on both sides. Once you've done that, we're going to sew the crotch. So put them face to face and then align all the front and back and inseam. And again, we're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for all of these. You can also serge these. You don't have to use the single needle. Now that we have the front and back joined together, we're going to sew the binding along the side seam and hem using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Before I go any further, I want to show you what this looks like with the binding all the way around the front and back. So here I am. I'm going to trim off the triangle notches, and before you do this, I would recommend marking where you're going to have to stop on the side seam. So that would be the bottom notch. So just like the pocket, you're going to mark 1/2 inch from the cut edge and fold over the binding, press it, and then you'd want to pin the right side of the fabric, the part that's going to be facing upwards when you're sewing. It's a little harder to remove pins when it's on the bottom. So if you forgot to mark your notches, you can do so by lining up the pattern piece and just putting a pin or remarking it. And here is the stay stitch that you can see on the binding, and I'm just going to pick that out. You shouldn't have too much excess binding on the back, but if you do, you can always trim it out. Here's where it gets a little tricky. You want to overlap, so you have the under binding and then you have the top binding. And then you want to sew a 1/4 inch from the top binding. So you're going to stitch over the original binding. If you want, you can also do another row right next to it on the very edge. Just make sure when you get to the bottom where you had pinned or you made a mark that you stop there. You can also do another secure tack going horizontal. So we just finished sewing the side seams together. Now we're going to move on to the waistband. And I still have my notches here. If you don't, you can always get the pattern piece and mark where it is, but it's 7/8 of an inch. If you serged it, then you would have the seam allowance pressed to one side. If you use a single needle, you can press this open to reduce the bulk. You can also, if you have a serger, you can finish the edge on the top and then fold it over and sew the waistband. So I'm going to go around and pin the waistband down, measuring as I go, or you can always mark it and pin it. It's up to you. And then what I like to do is I'm going to start sewing on the left side and then sew all the way around and finish on the right side. And this will make it easier when the time comes to install the drawstring. So for my drawstring, I'm going to use twill tape, and to install this you can use a safety pin or one of these tools. I like to feed the twill tape through the eyelet first and then pin it down so I don't lose it, and then go feed it through the waistband and then out through the front again. So I'm going to show you how to use the safety pin. Just attach it to the end and feed it through to the other side. This is the most common thing to use and the cheapest, and the thing that you probably have on hand. Here's another tool from Dritz. This is really nice. You can just feed it through. The only thing is sometimes you will lose it if it gets stuck at a tricky spot or something. You might end up losing it. This one is great to have as well, although it doesn't work on all casings, but if you have a narrow casing, this one would be ideal to use. So once you get to the end, you just feed it through the eyelet or grommet into the front, and then you have the drawstring. You can also add the elastic to that as well with the same methods. And then what you want to do to finish it off is to finish the casing of the waistband and continue sewing that little section in the front. I hope you've enjoyed how to make these Tyler knit shorts. For more tutorials and patterns, check out poxcouture.com.